about hitting it on a high note to open things up here. Make sure we're on YouTube. Yeah, yeah, looks like we're good. All right. All right, man. So here we go. Once again, welcome to the Integral Edge from Integral Life. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and I'm the author most recently of When the Buddha Needs Therapy. I work as a executive leadership coach and as a book coach. My guest today is my good friend, David Arell. We've spoken a few times over the last few months. He is also an executive coach and consultant, and his background is in entrepreneurship and leadership development. And he's really all about growth and development and supporting individuals and organizations and making meaningful and positive change in the world. And today we are going to be talking about becoming whole in a divided world. And this conversation is really about how to stop othering and start growing beyond us and them. And, my 2 cents on this would be that, I don't know if you've noticed, but we've gotten into sort of a really pretty unique time of us and theming. And it's kind of extraordinary. It's really kind of extraordinary what's going on. And the story I want to start off with is years ago, maybe 2017, 2018, somewhere in there. I was listening to, I think it was Joe Rogan podcast, and he had the magician Penn Jillette on. And they were talking about politics and about Trump, and Penn Jillette kept saying, when we voted for Trump and our President Trump and, this sort of stuff. And at some point, Rogan said, Penn, you're a pretty hardcore liberal, aren't you? And he was like, yeah. And he said, you voted for Trump. And he said, no, I didn't vote for Trump. He said, I just find it's really helpful when I switch the language from them to us because he's our president. And in essence, we voted for him because he's running the whole country. And I find when I change my language to say we instead of they, it just helps shift my whole perspective into something that's more whole and complete and compassionate towards other people. And it opens up my whole mind to perspectives that I might not hold. Something like that. And it really blew me away that here's a guy talking about how we voted for Trump when he didn't vote for Trump, but he was including himself in that sort of category. So I think that's a great place to start with you, David, and we'll just sort of kick the conversation off from there.
Yeah, is a great segue into the challenge that we all face.
No, they face those other people that do us and them. We've clearly evolved beyond that, you and I.
Yeah, for the most part, except when we deal with, except when we counter them in front of us at the traffic light that turns green and they're still sitting there, and then they pretty quickly become a them. Yeah, that's a great setup. How do we identify when we're sort of collapsing down into that more tribal mindset of an us versus them dynamic? What do we notice about how the world we're perceiving changes in that space? How is it probably less helpful, effective, compassionate, agentic than where we would like to be operating from? What are those reactive patterns that we as individuals tend to manifest when we're in those triggered, collapsed, condensed moments? And how can we pause, take a breath, and bring ourselves up to a more creative choice response opportunity in those moments? So, in contradistinction to the previous two talks we've had, which the first one was about the abstract nature of developmental theory and cultural content and the structure content fallacy, talking about theory. The second talk was about them, why did they vote this way? And we sort of applied that framework to understanding better the world around us and the way people can make choices that aren't necessarily bad just because they're different or good because they're the same as ours, but the level of complexity and the internal meaning making that led to those choices. This talk is about you.
Okay, so hold on. You just dumped a whole bunch of content on us. So what you're saying, in other words, is that someone could be on Team Keith and vote for the person I voted for, but if I actually dug down and listened to them, they might be doing it for reasons that I vehemently disagree with. right?
Absolutely. And they could
Or
be make
or the other way around. There could be someone that voted for Team Trump and I voted for Team Kamala, but the Team Trump person voted for the same principles that I voted for Kamala for, right? So that's what we're talking about.
well, that's what we talked about in our last talk.
That's what I mean. Yeah, yeah.
What were they thinking? Yeah. And exactly. We're looking at these structural ways of making sense of the world and making our choices based on certain ways of understanding the world that are independent of the content. But today's talk, and this is where I think there's so much juice, is we're not talking about what were they thinking as we explicitly were last time. We're talking about like, what am I thinking?
Right.
How am I operating? And to the listeners, I'm inviting every listener, both live here and in the recorded version, to be inquiring of themselves as we go through some of the things we're going to get through today. And this is about you. It's about you as an individual and what are the characteristics that are relevant to you as an individual that are much more meaningful and juicy and significant than the various tribal identity or affiliations or cultural backgrounds that you have and you share with many other people. I'm inviting you to listen and see how you can stay grounded and stay rooted in that, but how you can reach upwards and out of that tribal mindset to embrace that authentic, that sacred individuality, that sense of agentic wholeness that we've sort of framed up here with the title. And what's the perception that comes from that, where we see the greater we, whether it's going from Dem Republican to citizen of the US, which makes it us, or that sort of trans-temporal greater humanity that we all share, that basic dignity. So that's the invite here, is the self-reflect for you and I, Keith, but then all of our listeners to notice those catches and find ways to elevate ourselves out of that collapsed space.
Okay, great. And let's just say here, I mean, you live in a deeply red state, and I live in a deeply blue city or town, really. And, to me, there's sort of two reflections, both one, the stereotypes that we would encounter or imagine, or one, often wrong. So that's an interesting thing that we could dive into at some point. And two, it's interesting how bad the othering has become. I mean, like, I know dozens of people that hate MAGA. And I mean, they hate them with the same vehemence as if they were goose stepping and literally dragging women and children from their homes into the streets and shooting them. I mean, it's the level of hatred and internal opposition is staggering, right? And they have all sorts of reasons why they would justify that, right? We look at what's happening, the blah, blah, blah. And I'm not sure what's going on sort of culturally where you live, but presumably it's not as intense because the right is in power right now.
So I live in Prattville, Alabama right now, which is a little small town adjacent to Montgomery, which is the state capital of Alabama. And ironically, one of the original capitals of the South. So there were very few Biden signs,
I bet.
Kamala signs in and around the neighborhoods. And ironically, I lived out in Colorado previously in Colorado Springs, which is a part of the most of Colorado that's more red than the Denver Boulder blue bubble there. And I saw way more MAGA stuff out there in Colorado than I do here. Most people, I didn't really see any political signs around here. A lot of people around here are more sort of salt of the earth, and they're busy. They're busy working. They got kids. They got families. There's a lot of, churches around here. I joke that, I drive out of my neighborhood and there's a church, and then 2 minutes up the road, there's another church, and then another one. And that's pretty prevalent. And most people just aren't really tracking what's happening up there in Washington, D.C., and they're just not all that interested in that. And so what I do find when I'm talking to people, whether I'm checking out at the grocery store or I'm interacting, my wife's an active duty Air Force pediatric nurse practitioner. So I often interact with people at the base that are coming from different places. But most people are focused on what's going on with your kids and where have you caught fish recently? There's just very much a focus on day to day. And you find when you actually talk to real people, that most people are people first and party second, third, or fourth, and they're just trying to get through their day. And they say please, and they say thank you, and they say yes, ma'am, and no, sir. And I'm always slightly embarrassed when somebody calls me sir. I'm like looking for my dad behind me. I'm
Right.
like, oh, wait,
Right.
I'm the old guy now, you know. So I think there's that's the kind of place I want to orient our framing when we're looking at the world, rather than putting these tribal filters up, to sort of look through them or even off to the side and to meet the people as individuals in front of us and try to connect with them at that heart basis as like a fellow human, sort of adrift in the world these days, and trying to make the most of it for themselves and their family. So that's something I would say there. The balkanization of the media driven narratives on all sides is a separate topic we can get into. But just a sense of connecting with people and seeing people as people first and foremost, in that shared heart space of human dignity, and, you know, trying to make a life for themselves that's meaningful, relevant, interesting, and sustaining, I think is an opportunity we all have when we're connecting with people at the grocery store or in line, or even if they're parked in front of us at a green light and they're not going, a little gentle toot is perhaps more appropriate than a you know, kind of response that tribal mindset might activate.
All right, great, man. Well, why don't we get this thing started?
Yeah, absolutely. Where would you like to kick off? I have 6 hours worth of notes here. So where do you want to start?
Well, unfortunately, this is not the Joe Rogan experience, so we will not be going for 3.5 hours. But you know, I think maybe, it's sort of up to you. Why don't we, we could talk about, you could maybe, I don't know if the structure content fallacy is something you want to get into, the idea of how we create them, create a them, maybe where that's proficient and where it's deficient, but it's really up to
Sure.
you.
All right. Well, let me throw a concept out that I think is helpful for all of us, just to sort of give us a little spaciousness around, and that's the idea of what is a hyper object. This
Okay.
is a term coined by a philosopher's name is Thomas Morton, and a hyper object is anything that is so big that we can't see it because we're necessarily embedded in it. And often that is because it's bigger than our current spatial perceptual apparatus allows, but also our temporal perceptual ability allows. Some examples of a hyperobject would be the economy. Like, we're embedded in it. We can't really directly see it. We can influence it perhaps with some of the choices we make, but it's sort of this vague abstraction, but that nonetheless is real. Same with evolution, climate change, the biosphere. And so
Consciousness.
consciousness would be perhaps the meta hyper object, especially if you go into that, radical monism of everything as consciousness as the primary force. That's a whole different, that's a rabbit warren, not even a single rabbit hole. That's a whole rabbit warren of awesomeness there. But yeah, so what we're dealing with today, just to give us all some space, is we're talking about two hyper objects and the way they interrelate. The first of which is, what is individual development? What does that trajectory look like from birth or even pre-birth all the way up through old age? And what are the developmental stages, the processes, using Ken Wilber's language? What is that developmental ladder? Who are we as the climber, and what is the view that unfolds at these subsequent levels of altitude? How is that different than the attitude that may come from having that direct perception, but also the attitude that may come from having a secondhand perception when somebody's telling you this is what the world looks like, and you're like, okay, I believe it, but you're at that lower level where you can't quite see it, so you're sort of left to construct your own imaginary version, which is necessarily going to be a diluted, less complex, less nuanced version of that higher altitude. So that's one hyper object that we're kind of working with, a developmental matrix, so to speak. The second one is the cultural hyper object that we all live in here as you and I, as Americans in 2025. Anybody else listening is wherever they are, and how that hyper object also can't be directly perceived and can only be abstracted. As I was thinking about today's talk, I was thinking about, like, what are we as an individual? And what's a fascinating bit to share here is our mothers at some point in time had one of their eggs be implanted by the sperm of one of our dads. And that was a localized event that had the DNA from the egg and the DNA from our father's sperm coming together. And that's kind of how we started. But our individual trajectory is influenced by what was the environment of our mothers when that was happening. And even more sort of meta is that that egg that you and I were made from was formed when our mother was in utero in our grandmother's womb within the first couple months of her fetal development. So there's all these fascinating studies that track the sort of like feast or famine social realities of grandmothers and how that impacts the second generation based on the eggs that were produced by your mother as a fetus in your grandmother's womb, and how that shows up today.
Are you talking about sort of like the epigenetic studies that show that various kinds of traumas can be passed down through the epigenetics to children and grandchildren through the maternal
It's
line?
beyond, yeah, it's beyond epigenetics. It's also genetics. Like people that are grandmothers were raised in like a famine
Or
will
the
tend to be
Holocaust?
shorter in stature.
Yeah.
Yeah, will tend to be shorter in stature than those who weren't from equivalent time frames.
Oh, I see. Okay. So in other words, if even if grandma was raised in famine and daughter was born into relative abundance, daughter will still be short.
Right.
Okay.
Because yeah, exactly. And or shorter, again, we're talking
Yeah,
about
yeah.
generalities. And you can look at like, language. Like we were raised in a culture where the language was given. We talk about the way our mothers were able to birth us and what kind of support were they given. Was it, look at some of the different cultures where new mothers are the focus of the culture, and there's a lot of protection and allowance and support that new mothers and babies get, versus maybe some places here in the US where a new mom without a good benefits package from her job is like, okay, great, we'll see you back to work next week. And
Okay.
now she's
I
trying to
see.
figure out how to do childcare.
You're painting a very broad picture. So bring it a little closer to what we're talking about here.
Okay, so back to the sense of the cultural hyperobject. We can't really perceive culture with any degree of fine granular fidelity.
Yeah.
So we're going to kind of talk about cultural tendencies. We're going to talk about individual developmental tendencies. We're going to talk about how they interrelate here today. So just giving us all a little space, like this isn't the exact most precise. It's impossible to be precise when you're discussing hyperobjects. So just the being able to allow us to work in generalities that is directionally correct without necessarily needing to be 100% statistically to the second decimal point degree of correctness. So just that invitation to allow us to be open and in the complex space here, I think is a helpful place to start. How does that work for you?
Sure. Yeah.
Awesome. So do you want to touch on the individual developmental trajectory first to sort of set the stage here a little bit more clearly?
I mean, most of the listeners here are familiar with adult development. So, we're going to be talking about the sort of, the movement from, basically from red or power-based to amber, rule-based to umber, which is early rational with some elements of absolutism and some capacity for rationality, to orange rational, to green post-rational. And then, of course, this critique, this construct is coming from Teal, which can obviously see all those things as objects in the awareness in which we're speaking. So that's probably enough of an overview.
Okay, great. What I would help us focus in on there is what is that growth, all the growth up through and into that third order, using Keegan's language, that third order of tribalism, of that blue socialized mindset, of that sense of cultural integration. This is what every culture around the world has been its main objective, is how to turn selfish, self-centered children into functioning members of the tribe that are contributing to the tribe's ongoing success. Culture is the big superpower that's allowed humans, I mean, as individuals, we suck as far as being evolutionary competitive. Like me in the woods, I don't really have a really good chance. Humans, we don't have nails, we don't have teeth, our skin's pretty weak, we don't have fur. Like, we're not good individually, but as a social culture, we've basically conquered the face of the planet in the sense that we occupy every ecological niche from pole to pole, from mountaintops to swamps and everywhere in between. So getting the young members of the tribe to be competitive, contributing communal adults is what humanity is based upon. That's the success. So that's getting people to be functionally within integrated at that healthy third order socialized mind. So the challenge there is what happens as people start to mature beyond that into that emergent, fully individualized fourth order, more autonomous framework. What does that look like? And how does that different and a progression versus a regression back to selfishness? So a
Okay, so hold on. So
critical,
let me interrupt you there for a second, just
yeah,
because I think if we take a really long historical view, right? So you only went back to Amber, but I think really we should go back much further, which is to say, for most of human evolution, humans were banded together, Homo sapiens were banded together in small tribal units for survival, and the tribal unit was a couple hundred people, and that had very important consequences for our development and this entire talk. Who do we consider? What do we consider wholeness? What do we consider other, right? And so that process began hundreds of thousands of years ago, which other is whoever isn't in the tribe, right? It's like I know the 150 people in the tribe, and some guy walks in, and I don't know him. Well, that's not good, right? And so there's a ton of biological brilliance in viewing that stranger as a very likely threat. Better to kill him and be safe than not kill him and be sorry, right? So I think it's important that we take that step all the way back there and allow that, right? Evolution really goes, developmental evolution, we don't get into amber until the world becomes safe enough that there are structures possible that can protect and ensure that survival isn't just going to go out the window at any moment. And so amber doesn't really come online until really a couple thousand years ago, right? In pockets as the bleeding edge of evolution. And so I just want to give that slightly broader perspective because we're talking about self and other.
right, right.
Part of what I'm going to argue is that the othering that we do is completely natural and normal. And
Yeah, absolutely.
we shouldn't have this talk where like you're doing something wrong if you're othering people. It's like no, like you're programmed to other people. The question is, as they say in men's work, how's it working for you? Right. So
Right,
with
right.
that slightly broader context, please continue.
Yeah, and I think what you've hit upon there is important to make sure we're keeping in mind is that this developmental progression from like kid with no responsibilities and sort of swimming in the waters of your local tribe or culture, the Dunbar number you mentioned 150, like that was sort of like that's kind of the most we can sort of easily keep track of when it comes to individual relationships. Who are we in that context? And as we mature, and this is what so many of more traditional cultures are really good at, is having rites of passage and rituals that demarcate when we need to leave childhood behind and enter into, a fully functioning member of the tribe. And that whole definition is predicated on the us versus them distinction. We do this, they do that. We do this, they that. We speak this language, they speak that language, and there's a range of allowances that very healthy, grounded, integrated me as a member of open up to us. There's affordances there. It gives us opportunities for what does it mean to be successful, whether it's a prototypical tribe from several 100,000 years ago, or just you and me today. Like, what does it mean? What does it mean to be an American? I mean, that today, that's such a like a fractured question. But for many places, it's like, oh, if I want to achieve the things that are helpful, then these paths are laid out and advertised as helpful. Like go to college, get a job, make good money, become a lawyer, become a doctor. That brings with it financial security. It brings with it a degree of social status. It brings with it a degree of autonomy. You can look at David Rock's SCARF work, the acronym SCARF: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. That acronym, this is what people need to thrive in an organization, like a company, or in a culture as a whole. And so there's a lot of value to really kind of embracing, I'm on the team. I'm part of the team. Rah, 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 go us. So
Okay.
I think you're right to really lean into the proficient and valuable aspects of that for sure.
Sure, right. And then there's living in a blue state, or excuse me, a blue city and a purple state. But there's what is it? There's a comfort in sort of swimming in the ideological sameness of people around you that I think a lot of us have, right? And there's a lot of studies that have shown, somewhat alarmingly, but that people seem to be moving in greater numbers and with greater frequencies to places that mirror the political opinions that they have, so that we're sort of becoming more polarized geographically as time goes by, which is, another potential problem that we're facing with, how many red cities are there? There's very few, right? How many blue rural counties are there? There's not a whole bunch anymore. And that didn't used to be the case, right? I mean, you and I are the same age, half a century ago, it was nowhere near that cut and dry. The whole South was Democratic right back then.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to there, you alluded to earlier with this sort of balkanization of narratives. Like, who are the tribes, and how are we getting exposed information that is, intentionally feeding the flames of that lower tribal identity, that sense of I'm a red state, I'm a blue state. Like, that's a very Americanized way to view things. That like you're either on team red or team blue. Most European countries have a whole collection of political parties, and it's not just such a hard binary line. And the way, we touched upon this previously, and this is a bit of an aside here, but so much of what we get as information is not from one-on-one conversations with people around us. It's what we're seeing via media. And I
Sure.
want to make a very big distinction between, people have this idea that like social media is bad. It's like, well, no, it's not. It neither is traditional media. Like, media, if you look at it, is different than the message. Like, that's the whole distinction there. Like, water is a media that propagates energy waves. And so the media is just what you're doing and how you're getting information. But so it doesn't matter if it's social media or the New York Times or whatever. It's like, more importantly is what kind of information you're getting, and how much of that is algorithmically programmed to be sent to you based on your likes and your dislikes and your curated feed of whatever it is. Like, buying the New York Times every day or having it sent to you on Sundays, that's just as much a curated feed as going on Twitter or Blue Sky or wherever and like following a certain number of people, and you're going to get their perspective sent to you. Just like the New York Times, you've automatically signing up to get the perspective of the people they employ and the political, philosophical, social positions that they support. So I think the question here is becoming more curious of like, how much are your tastes actually your own, and how much are they algorithmically programmed into you based on what you're intentionally exposing yourself to, and then what you're unintentionally exposed to as well, I think are
Right.
good questions there.
Right. Well, and let's pause there. You were talking about at the top of this call, what was it? The meta what?
Oh, the hyper object.
The hyperobject. So, I mean, again, there's for me some sympathy looking at the hyperobject of media or media consumption. You have to be able to break out of some way of seeing that you might be in a particular sphere of opinion or of perspective. Maybe that would be a better way to look at it, right? So it's like, if I'm only reading the Post and the Times, it would not be unreasonable for me to think that I'm getting objective news, because for a long time that was the widely agreed upon truth, right? I think sort of
Mm-hmm.
culturally most people would agree. And then what did we have? We had Fox News came along about 25 years ago, and the idea that the media was unbiased began to get questioned, and then that sort of fractured further with the first election of Trump in 2016, and then you had this sort of woke thing, and you had Me Too, and you had George Floyd, and with all these things happening, it seems to a lot of smart people that are looking at things that the media has become more fractured and more polarized itself. The idea that journalism is supposed to be objective, which is what? That's a good sort of fourth order orange ideal, right? We're going to be objective and rational. And if I'm a journalist, I'm not going to allow my personal opinions to
Yeah.
influence my reporting. And I'm not going to tell you who I vote for. That was baked into the fabric of a lot of these institutions. And one of the insights of postmodernism is that it basically tore the hood off that and said objectivity isn't possible. And you're really kidding yourself if you think that you're holding on to an objective truth. And there's validity in the criticism, but it's also a partial criticism, right? Because there's, like all these things we're talking about, there's degrees of objectivity and degrees of subjectivity. So there's no such thing as pure objectivity, which a number of philosophers have pointed out. But I might be more objective than you are, right? Or less objective than you are, depending on how things go. And so this, and I'll finish this thought here. This is just sort of the part of the problem I think that we're swimming in over the last 10 years is it's not just that we as individuals have drifted into more us versus them, but it's all the institutions that are informing us and all the institutions in which we're interacting with, from the New York Times to Fox News to Facebook.
Yeah. And you know what I think you're really speaking to there, and this is sort of the crux of the challenge, is that the pull to identify with our tribe is just, it's amazingly powerful. Yeah. It's such a powerful motivator. And one of the core tensions I want to illustrate here, if you look at, so you have this sort of like massive center of gravity around our tribal identity that is like
largely unconscious.
Yeah, largely unconscious, because it happened to us as, as I mentioned, in utero, through birth, right, through being raised, through, if you grow up if you grow up around here in Prattville, Alabama, you're probably going to grow up in a Christian household. Yeah, that probably is going to have you doing the Pledge of Allegiance at school. And you're probably going to learn about George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and not lying, and Abraham Lincoln saved the country from slavery. You're going to hear, that's the reality you grow up in. That's probably very different than if you grow up in a super liberal household in Boulder. Mm-hmm. And it's different than you're going to grow up if you grow up, working as your parents both work at Los Alamos Labs in the nuclear physics department. You're going to be encultured into very different worldviews, sure, but it's all happening unconsciously. You didn't do an objective-ish analysis of competing worldviews and then choose one that made no sense for you. When you're 20, you're in it. You're in the hyper object of your localized worldview.
Right. And we're still in it too. We're just, what would we say? We know we're in it, and so it gives you a little bit more wiggle room, right? That's the we're a little bit more objective. We're not objective with the capital O, but right, we're a little more objective than a 20-year-old because we can at least see that we're caught.
Well, exactly. And that's where the value of travel or otherwise diversifying your life experiences are, so that you can actually come home and see it again for the first time, because now you have additional fish bowls to sort of compare to. Like, oh, I went and lived in Thailand for a year. Now I came back to the US and I see it differently. And it's the same ShopRite I went to 2 years ago, but now I see it differently. Or people that go to war and come back. It's like, it's a culture shock, and it's an ontological shock, because the culture is the entire basis of their constructed identity at that level. So I want to emphasize the magnetic gravitational power, and there's a separate impulse operating it within us, and that's what I call the holotropic growth drive. We aspire to wholeness. We aspire to grow. And like some fruit trees, like the baobab tree, for instance, it lives to be 200 years old before it starts making fruit sometimes. Like apple trees, maybe it's like 7 years. So up until this process of enculturization, this center of gravity is a very comfortable container. But as our innate human growth drives, and this is the beauty of adult developmental theory, is that there's growth beyond the socialized mind of being a good contributing member of the team. As those start to activate and intensify based on how old we are and what our experiences are and our sort of whatever genetic mix of interests and aspirations we have, that creates a core tension. How to be an authentic individual when we have these cultural constraints of roles that we agreed to participate in multiple years prior, sometimes even decades prior. This is the midlife crisis. Like, oh shoot, I'm waking up and realize that I'm living in somebody else's life. I mean, you see this you hear about this happening all the time. So that core tension,
well,
let me pause really in play here. Yeah,
because I just want to tell a personal story here, so this isn't so abstract. But you and I have been friends a long time, and I guess just about 20 years ago, probably almost to the day, you and I were walking in Philadelphia, and you asked me a very simple question, which was, "How are you?" And the funny thing back in those days, right? We didn't really check in with each other in a really heartfelt way very often, but it was a really heartfelt thing. And I actually took you at your word. How are you? And I was like, I'm actually not doing good at all, man. Like, and you're like, really? What's going on? I was like, oh, like somehow I'm married. I don't really want to be married, and like I'm working a job that I don't really want, and like I ended up buying a house that I didn't really want to buy a house, and I have a boat and a car, and like, and you were like, yeah, like you're living the American dream. Like most people would love to be where you are right now. And I was like, yeah, but I never wanted any of these things. Like, how did I end up here? Right. And I
Yeah.
really remember it because to what you're saying, it was like for the first time in my life, I popped out of this enculturated thing and was like, wait a minute, and I was 32, not 52, thank goodness, right? But it was like, and then what happened? 2 years later, I was gone. I was divorced. I quit my job. I packed up all my shit, right? It was like, I did what you do, right? I started over. It was like,
Hmm.
I want to live life on my terms now. So maybe that just humanizes it to me. So
Yeah.
maybe to speak to that a little bit as far as this sort of emergence, right? We're talking about an emergence here into something where we're breaking free of some of this enculturation.
Exactly. And what I love about that story is your question was, who am I and what am I doing here? And I don't know the answer, but I know this isn't it. So
Exactly.
that was that degree of existential separation to where you could partially perceive the hyper object of your life and be like, I don't want any of this. As a matter of fact, I never really wanted. I kind of like backed my way into it because I was following the cultural gravity, the expectations of cultural gravity. That's like, well, I remember vividly when you told me that you had proposed to your then girlfriend to be your wife. And I was like, what's that about? And you're like, I figured it's time to shit or get off the pot. And I'm like, I don't think that's a good reason to get married. But you're like, it's,
Well,
what am I doing here?
that's where it goes, right? You date, and then you get married, and then you buy a house, and right, that's just the script you follow. And
Yeah.
it's ironic because we were, studying Wilber's theories and all that, and yet, to your point, the power of culture is much more powerful than the power of thought.
Well, and again, I want to be clear. I'm not faulting you for this or any
No,
of
of
us who
course.
make these
Yeah,
decisions.
yeah.
It was just you weren't at a time where you were actually able to emerge out of the cultural dream that you were co-creating in cahoots unconsciously with the world around you that we all do. And then you
Mhm.
kind of popped out of it. And to your point, you're like, shit, what's this? Is
Yeah.
that my signature on that
This is
line?
not my
Because,
beautiful wife. This is not my
right.
beautiful house. Right.
Yeah, David Byrne was speaking a lot louder to you that day, and so I think that's what I think is so interesting here is that authentic individuality
Okay.
of
What
seeing
we're
yourself.
talking about a maturing fourth order, fully beginning to, I don't want to use the word fully, let's just say beginning to differentiate from the enculturation. And in some ways, different parts of me were obviously well beyond fourth order because we were studying Wilbur and all this, but this is what makes development and what we're talking about here so complex, which is
Hmm.
that as a whole human being, I have a relational self and a relational intelligence. I have a individual self and individual intelligence, emotional, trauma-based things, somatic, all these lines of intelligence. And while some of them were clearly at Teal and Integral, some of them clearly were not, right? And this is something I come back to again and again, which is that, we're not just our cognitive line. And you and I know quite a few integralists that their relational line is well, let's just say not integral.
And as I'm sure and this is what's so amazing about this is that we all have our leading edges to where we're really when we're able to kind of be on that edge, we're doing good, we're feeling good, we're being good. And then we all have our lagging anchors where we're held back in ways we don't even know, other than we see, again, it's a hyper object, so we see glimpses of it, or we see the impact, or 2 hours later we're like, why did I say that in that meeting, or why did I say that with that tone? That wasn't how I want to be. Or you reread that email and you're like, no, this isn't this felt really true at the moment, but this is not unhelpful. Let me go back and redo this before I send it. And so that emergence into that authentic individuality, that sacred individuality, is what I want to make sure is the golden thread we're sort of running through this whole
Yeah,
thing
yeah, yeah.
here.
Let's really get into this practice of sacred individuality. I think we're touching on it now. We're talking about differentiating from the cultural blob into an individuality. So, what is your understanding of this sacred individuality? Because it very much relates to the us and them.
Right, right. So my sense of this sacred individuality is the balance of really seeing ourselves as an agent in the world where we have creative choice, we have opportunities that life isn't happening to us so much as we're responding to the circumstances around us. It's taking that ownership, that opportunity, and embracing the accountability and responsibility that comes with it. This is one part of the what I'll talk about here. But Hegel, the philosopher, has a famous quote that absolute freedom equals absolute terror. And I see this with my clients all the time. They're like, "Well, if I do this, then I don't know what's going to happen." I'm like, "Yeah, well, the not knowing is probably pretty scary, but it's all the what ifs that if you press this button, all those consequences come back to
Well,
you.
let's just slow it
That's
down.
terrifying."
Let's just slow it down for a second. So in other words, and, and you and I have gone through this personally, but as we move through our development and as we gain the capacity to be able to come out of these hyper objects and begin to differentiate and begin to see the ways that we're enculturated, right? We gain autonomy. We gain the capacity for different kinds of choice making, which is the proficient side, right? But the deficient side is that we gain more freedom, and this Hegelian idea that absolute freedom equals absolute terror, right? It's the very idea that sort of Nietzsche came up with as well, right? If we gain the capacity to deconstruct God himself, then all we're left with is the Übermensch, or this idea of the will to power. All that's left is to choose power, because that's all that's left. And that's terrifying, right? I mean, it drove Nietzsche crazy. Be careful when you look into the abyss, that the abyss doesn't look back.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to me, what is that, right? That's why I've deconstructed meaning and self, and now I look into that. And if you don't know how to take the step beyond that, right? Is that what you're speaking towards?
Yes, partially. Where I would want to put a finer distinction is that you don't necessarily gain more functional autonomy as you emerge in the fourth order. You gain more clarity about where you do have autonomy. Like you could be in prison with no real autonomy whatsoever, but if you are emerging into and embracing the fourth order framework, it allows you to take ownership over where you do have autonomy, such as choosing your attitude, choosing how you're going to respond when the guard looks at you.
I think I was one beyond that with my example. Yeah.
And so you obviously were looking at the abyss, but just clarifying, you have more choices, and then the awareness of what comes from those choices.
Got it.
And I feel, I'll share a personal anecdote. I remember when I was in grad school a long time ago, given how old I am now, as it turns out, I remember, very, very much feeling like I was the last leaf on a tree, and the wind was just blowing and blowing and blowing. And I was like, man, at any day now, the wind could blow me off this tree, and I will be disconnected. I will be in the aperspectival madness that comes from not having a singular stake in what is real. And you actually you visited at one point there, and you're like, dude, are you okay? I'm like, no. Much to your point, like, no, I'm not okay, man. Like, I got all kinds of crazy thoughts going on here, and anything could be real or nothing could be real. And there was a deep pull to like, man, if I could just join a monastery and not have to figure all this stuff out, that would be great.
Yeah.
Relieving myself of that existential burden of being in charge of my own meaning making in the world.
So
it was terrifying.
I think we're really touching on three things: amber to orange, really to beginning to move into pretty mature green, right?
Yeah, I want to stay in the amber to orange matrix here, because I believe this is where the effort to be whole in a divided world, this is where that needs to be devoted. Because when we're triggered, when we're activated, when we're caught up with one of our lagging anchors, usually it's in that third order phase of our development that has that heavy gravitational feel. It feels good to be Like, if you've ever gone to a football game and you wear the color of your team, it feels good to be joining 50,000 people cheering as your team scores a touchdown. Or if you've gone to a European soccer game, European football, like that's some like crowd power there. It's like, wow, you can feel the power of the crowd. They're all singing their songs and swaying. And it's like, man. And then the idea of being the focal point of the ire of the mob is correctly terrifying. So there's that pull, but then there's that, that holotropic growth towards wholeness as you get into that space. And that's where I feel like a lot of the dynamic tensions are today, because there's a lot of really smart, well-developed people that are walking around functionally operating from that lower tribal mindset, like you mentioned. Like if you hate a fellow American for the color of their hat, then that's on you. Like that's on you to look to yourself and be like, wow, why am I so tribally activated here? Especially when the person in front of you with the red hat on or the blue hat is just sort of standing there. Like you've got this story you've constructed about what they are doing while the person in front of you is like holding the door for you to go in the grocery store.
Well, that's right. So
cognitive dissonance.
Right. And so let's just back this up a little bit to sort of give this a more compassionate frame for me, which is, so we're talking about this movement from amber enculturation to orange individualism. And for a lot of us, which we were touching on, you and I both, moving from that into sort of a green deconstructed, beginning to see the matrix, right? And how that can be both liberating and terrifying at the same time. So that's the sort of the arc that we're talking about. And within that, that's the individual arc. Within that, we're talking about this cultural arc that we've touched on, which has we've gone from quote unquote trusted media sources that are quote unquote objective, that everyone quote unquote knows, to this odd time now where I have my media and you have your media, and I have my social group and you have your social group, and I live in Boulder and you live in Alabama, and you're a stupid MAGA redneck and I'm a stupid bleeding heart liberal, and so we've moved to where the culture is really, I think, magnifying these divisions sort of regardless of where you are developmentally. So if I'm amber or I'm orange or I'm green, or even I'm moving into teal, teal has a little easier time seeing this, but this enculturation you're talking about, this hyper object, this blob that we've touched on, really does influence how I see the guy in the red MAGA hat, or how you see the car that has the wear a mask bumper sticker on it, right? And it's like those are going to be things that are going to really flare up and cause, at best, what Kim Barta would describe as a shadow crash. So I'm going to be like, well, those effing MAGA people, they're ignorant, they're this. And then I'm beginning to think like the guy in the European soccer crowd who's like, go Manchester. Suddenly it's Team Manchester versus Team whatever. And now you have a bunch of reasonably cognitively evolved liberals who are behaving as if they are more fundamentalists, let's say Christians, who are very much othering people not like them. So maybe you could speak a little bit to that. Well, one, if you agree with it, and two, your thoughts on it.
Well, I agree with the second half. I just want to clarify that I am temporarily residing in Prattville, Alabama. I was most recently in Fairfax, Virginia, just outside of DC. Before that, I was in Colorado. Before that, I was in Omaha. Before that, I was in Philly for like 15 years. So I am team neither. I am neither
well,
red
we're
nor
both
blue.
team neither. We're talking about that.
But you were for the casual listener. It sounded like all I was missing was my red hat, and it just like I don't have hats, much less a red one. So I just want to clearly, just put myself out there as independent-ish. And there's two things there I want to mention. You mentioned journalism as this sort of like being objective. I would push that the orange version of journalism is we aspire to objectivity. Mm-hmm. Same with orange version, like actual science, is we aspire to objectivity. What are all the ways our biases are in the way? And let's find ways to sort of like make sure that doesn't change, that doesn't overly influence the story we're talking about. So or even law, like we aspire to justice. And so we have all these things like due process and jury of your peers, and the defense gets to see the prosecution's evidence, and The only what the judge allows in the courtroom are what the jurors are allowed to use in making their decisions. It has to be preponderance of evidence, or depending on the nature of the crime, murder, it's like without a reasonable doubt. Like we're really aspiring to our best effort to hit these ideals, whether it's truth, objectivity, justice. What happens is the blue version of that, the tribal version is, it's not we're spying to objectivity. It's like we're objective, or we're just, or we're right. And you bake that in as a first principle, and then what follows becomes tolerable. So I'll use this one example here. So a very standard tribal approach to policing is law and order. Maybe you got to take the guy out back and rough him up again, or you got to break a few eggs, make an omelet, or maybe a few innocent people get put in jail. But by and large, law and order. Whereas the fourth order orange approach would be rule of law, which is protecting the individual rights and is really worried about accidentally punishing an innocent person. And the rule of law people are willing to let some guilty people go because punishing an innocent person is way worse. So there's a fundamental disconnect in how what sounds the same gets perceived. For example, the whole idea of the golden rule, this is an example Bob Keegan uses all the time. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And a tribal mindset, a third order socialized mind goes, right.
They would kill me, I'll kill them.
As they have done unto you. So reciprocity, which is the aspiring value of as you would have them do unto you, gets condensed into revenge. And they nod and they're like, yeah, I get it, man. Let's go get them. It's like, no.
So they hear that and they sort of hear Hammurabi's code, right? Eye for an eye, right? Oh yeah, do to them what they're going to do to you. Well, they're going to come here and rape us and pillage us and kill us, so we'll go and do that to them. That's what Christ said.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's like, it's all the classic Jesus jokes of like, turn the other cheek. Jesus. And he's like, well, except for the gays. No, turn the other cheek. Well, what about the adulterers? No. Like, if you look at them teaching of Jesus, he's like 2,000 years and we're still by and large massively missing the message there. So it's comical if it wasn't so sad and destructive like the Inquisition and everything else that we can easily point to of it being a misunderstanding, a lower order interpretation of a higher order calling.
Right. And so, which brings this conversation full circle, right? So it's like, so for me personally, right? Again, like to share a little of the vulnerability or something here, and I've shared this in other talks, but it's like, I shared with you some of my strong cultural bias against sort of Southerners a few months back. It's like, effing rednecks and, blah, blah, blah. And you were really like, honestly, man, like that's mostly your ignorance talking. Like, yeah, like there's guys around here that are like, definitely what you're saying, the projection of like, the guy you're going to roll your eyes to that has the rebel flag in the back of his truck and, whatever else is going on there. And there's a lot of kindness. There's a lot of gentleness. There's a lot of Christians that are genuinely Christ-like here. It's much more nuanced than your cultural projection is allowing. And it was a beautiful pushback, right? And it really just had me sort of check myself. Because ultimately this whole talk comes down to what are you going to do as an individual? Right? I'm not going to do shit for Boulder, right? You're not going to do shit for Alabama, right? We don't have the power to do much. I'm not running for governor or anything like that, nor are you. So where are we sovereign? Where does this matter? Well, it matters in how I shepherd my own thoughts and minds and feelings and reactivity, and where I want to catch where I'm beginning to other people, because it's not something that I want to do. And I want to really be able to catch myself. So maybe we could sort of bring this more into a personal sphere now.
Yeah, I love that. So as I mentioned, part of what I want to talk about when it came to this fourth order individuality is that authentic choice, creativity, and the responsibility that comes with that. The second half of that is the perception, using Ken Wilber's ladder climber view. The climber is me. I actually have some choice here to how I respond no matter what's kind of happening to me. But then what's the view? And the view allows me to see across time and across space the fundamental innate dignity that all of us humans as us share. And that's where a whole idea of universal human rights comes from. The idea of like democracy, like your vote should count as much as the king's partner. Like that's what this means. That innate the base dignity is both fundamental and that we all have it. So it kind of negates out to zero, but it's also significant. So we all have it and it counts a lot. So why I mention that here is we've talked previously about like, what's your circle of care? What's your circle of concern? Who's the we here? So rather than seeing, when you notice yourself us theming, add in the larger we, add in fellow citizen, add in fellow human,
Well,
add
the,
in
the, the
fellow.
Penn Jillette trick, right? So we voted for Trump.
Yeah.
And the policies that we're enacting on immigration, which I might say if I was really against it, because what does it do? It forces me to be empathetic, which doesn't mean I have to support it. And I think that's where a lot of people get really tripped up here.
Well, honestly, Keith, so many people get tripped up because they believe that they need to, that they're sort of unconsciously participating in tribal coherence. So, I used to joke with like posting the little memes of the gray NPC wearing the hat that says, I support the current thing.
Yeah,
It's like whatever the current thing is for my tribe, that's my opinion. And so Helen Pluckrose recently wrote an article about like, hey, I don't need to actually have an opinion on everything. I don't know. I don't have an opinion on what's happening with immigration. I have some notions, and I know people around me have a lot of strong opinions, and I could be tempted to parrot the opinions of the people I respect or believe, love, etc.
Right.
Or I could honestly be like, I really don't know that much about it. I've read this, I've read that. It seems pretty complex. There's a lot of passion. There's a lot of fighting happening about it. I mean, this is something that people argue about at dinner. I don't feel like I have enough information to have an opinion that I want to choose and then be responsible for defending when it comes to that like fourth order agency. What I'm concerned, there's a lot of people suffering is what it seems like, or same with like Gaza, Israel, or Ukraine, Russia, or all these like hotspots where there's prescribed opinions. If you believe, it's almost like you get the script. If I believe X, that means I believe Y and Z and A and B and C. That means I'm a good member good standing of team X versus team Y.
Right.
And
So-
as an individual,
Right.
the cultural predictive programming starts to become completely inaccurate once you become an authentic individual who you may be on all kinds of sides about different issues that don't line up in any way neatly with one side or the other. And I think that's something you and I have spoken about previously
Sure.
about any number of topics. It's like,
Well,
I
I've
can kind of
said-
see this, I see that.
I've said very clearly, like, I don't have an opinion on climate change because it's too complex. And I have lots of other things that I'm investigating actively. And I'm choosing not to investigate that one. I don't have kids. I live by myself. My carbon imprint's pretty small. I'm not running a huge multinational corporation, flying my private jet everywhere. It's like, I'm just like, I'm going to leave that to you guys. Have fun with it. Let me know what you all decide. Right.
Well, and again, it's a hyper object.
Right.
It's impossible to have an accurate perception of it. We're just basically making abstractions based on data points that are based on assumed accuracies, assumed relevance. So like any of these things, we're kind of doing our best guess, and it's okay not to have an opinion. It's like,
Well, that's
good
the
on
thing.
you. I would rather you just say, okay, man, I don't really know. Honestly, there's a lot of things I care about. And this is on the list of things. I'm going to not worry about it. I'm going to say I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to own it. And Dave, if you don't like me because I don't care about the topic of climate change, then that's okay too. And if, thankfully, that's one of a million things you and I have all kinds of different perspectives on. We're like, oh, cool.
I don't really have a perspective on it, except that I haven't
That's your perspective, though. That counts. You're on the record for not being on the record.
That's right. That's right.
But I want to again back to your point of like the basic dignity of a fellow human. When somebody opens the door for me at the Publix and they're wearing a MAGA hat, I smile and I say thank you. Or if somebody waves me in traffic when I'm running a little bit late to pick up my kids from school, and they have a Harris bumper sticker, which are by and large pretty rare around here, I wave and I say thank you. Like, their political affiliations irrelevant to the politeness and care I receive and appreciate and that I extend to them.
Right.
And Like if I see somebody who's stuck in traffic, one of my personal practices is to always let somebody in. And I don't really care what kind of car they're driving or how late I am. It's just a little way
Sure.
of contributing to a better functioning hyper object of our culture where somebody's like, oh, thank you. I'm glad they're probably in a hurry, you know?
Well, and let's put this. Let's steel man the othering of people here for a second. I know we read Tim Urban's book. What was
What's
it
our
called?
problem?
What's our problem, right?
Yeah,
And
we need to give a huge shout out to that book. Absolutely.
very, very good
Five
book.
stars.
Yeah, but the idea is like from a steelman position. If I'm on the left and I'm, we're talking about the media sources and the way that they've moved away from attempting to be objective to being less concerned about that, let's say. And then narratives are getting created, and I'm in my own little closed group, and maybe we're shadow crashing a little bit so that we're beginning to collapse the complexity that I might normally see, and I'm beginning to see what is largely my projection that's going on of, say, MAGA people. And then I'm consuming news sources that are feeding my cognitive bias. And I'm then really beginning to see that like what's happening, what those people, quote unquote, those people are doing is morally repugnant and wrong. And if I don't speak up and if I don't take a stand against this, it is horrifically immoral for me not to do so. That this is about right and wrong. This is about being on the right side of history. This is about taking a stand for what you should. This is not that different from being in Germany in 1936. We need to stand up before this gets totally out of control. And the moral certitude of that, right, has a nobility to it.
Yeah, and an extreme danger.
Right, but I want to steelman it first, right?
Okay.
Right. So the idea being that, because again, what I encounter with some of my close friends is, where they're coming from is a place. It feels important to me to honor that they're coming from a place of care.
So, yes, I mean, obviously,
And we can make the same argument on the other side, right? I mean,
yeah,
I could be saying the same thing on the right, looking at the left.
right, and that's exactly the point I'm looking to drift into here. It's like let's look at principles. You get moral status by adhering to principles in the face of resistance. So the question is, what are the principles in play here that I am so morally offended by? And let me be clear on how I'm parsing that out of party allegiance to principled objection. And that's where I think there's room. Again, this doesn't matter whether you're whatever side of whatever fence we want to talk about. The question is always, what are the principles in play here? And what is the difference between dignified rage and righteous anger? Like, again, that's where this idea of dignity comes in. And, we've always seen like the militant aggressive response to an alleged infraction on team A, and team B comes back and is like perpetrating the same exact things they're so worried about. And it's like, you're so worried about being dehumanized that you're dehumanizing the perpetrator. That's where like the lady sticking the flower in the muzzle of the policeman kind of thing is like, oh, I'm gifting you this flower, human to human, this shared dignity, this trying to introduce art or beauty into a tense dynamic is so helpful, because I believe this is the power of that gravitational pull. When we feel threatened, and this is like clicking out a few levels, when we feel threatened, especially if our identity is threatened, our dignity is threatened, our sense of safety is threatened, our belongingness is threatened, we contract. We contract into that more tribal identity, out of our agentic, granting everybody universal human rights, universal dignity, and the shared high common ground above our tribalism. We contract out of that and we're triggered, our shadow crash, as you say, and we're acting now from and through that tribal mindset, which is very happy to smash somebody's head in for the sake of righteous moralism, which is very happy to do all kinds of atrocities blinded by the inherent goodness and the righteousness of our position. That's where I think dignified rage of like a Gandhi or an MLK is very different than the righteous anger of, somebody in a remote tribal area that has their kid accidentally run over by a car, and the whole town comes out, pulls the driver out, and beats him to death on the street. Now, that happens all the time. You read about it all the time in like, certain isolated locales and like other countries where that kind of stuff is considered justice. And it's like, whoa, that's your kid ran in front of the car. Like, whose fault really is it here? But they're so contracted. It's a reactionary response rather than a creative response. Or reaction. It's a reaction instead of a creative response or a creative choice.
Okay, so let's bring this home a little bit. So the idea is, so for me personally, maybe you could speak to this. When I speak and talk to people who I care about, who seem very, we'll say, reactive to what's going on, it's a double-edged sword, right? I want to honor that there are things happening politically that I certainly disagree with and that I think are important to point out. I want to honor their sense of fear, contraction, and concern, which seem important to not dismiss. And I want to call to this idea of, to what you're saying, which is what are the deeper principles that you feel are being violated, and help them stand in those principles firmly, which can help to counteract the shadow crashing and to help counteract the othering. Because ultimately, that's what we're talking about here, right? It's exactly what you're saying. How, if I feel righteously indignant and righteously rageful, it's a good sign to me that I'm not in a good place to be acting.
Exactly.
I need to go deeper, right? And one of the questions that you posted here for us to sort of talk about a little bit was, when was the last time I felt totally right about how wrong someone else was? And I think that's a really interesting and good question.
Yeah, I think so. Let's take it back one degree of immediacy and imagine if you're coming to me as a client or as a friend or whatever, and you're in a very agitated state. What I'm curious to lean into is a triangle I mentioned earlier of your dignity, your belongingness, and your safety. How are you on this tripod of stability? And where are you really wobbly right now? And like, are you actually in danger right now? Like when somebody calls 911, like, are you in danger right this second? And getting them to be like, well, no, or yes, like, okay. And on a personal level, like, what's the felt sense of camaraderie here? What's the felt sense of connection? What's the genuine belongingness, even on this dyad? How present and real and tangible is it? Let's energize that. And then let's, as the coach or as a therapist or as the friend who's less destabilized in the moment, let's really talk about dignity. Like, man, I really see this is upsetting you. And I'm sure you have a lot of really good reasons here. And I want to validate my perception of your distress, and not immediately start challenging it or diminishing it or otherwise. Right. So once that sort of triangle of stability is there, now we can be more curious and start to unpack what's going on. Because ideally in that process, you will have settled down and you will feel more connected. You'll feel more safe. You'll feel more in a dialogue, and you'll feel my curiosity as an invitation, which is where that question comes in. Of like the certainty about somebody else being wrong, or whatever that next level of like intellectual engagement can be.
Right. Well, and part of that's what's used in trauma work, right? Someone's in a trauma response. It's like, hey, like, look around the room, are you okay? Yeah, I think so. Like, do you have what you need right now? Yeah, I think I do. It's like, can you breathe? Can you move? Okay. It seems like you're pretty safe in the moment. Is that true? Yeah, I think it is true. Right? So it's like getting people out of that fight, flight, freeze kind of response, which
exactly
is a big part of what's going on here. Mm-hmm. Right. And so yeah, you're asking the question, what has you feel unsafe or unheard or unseen? I like this too. You have this other question, what language do I use that collapses someone into a label?
Yeah, that I think is always an opportunity. Like, you mentioned her earlier at the beginning of our conversation about the power of language and framing things with the example of Penn Jillette. Mm-hmm. And part of me resists that. Like, some of the what we experienced in sort of like the political correctness of like renaming a bunch of things that seems to somehow ignore the fundamental truth of what's still happening. But I think there's value in like viewing ourselves as citizens, not as consumers. Like the consumers is what the pro-business news media calls us all. And that rubs me the wrong way. No, I'm not a consumer. I'm a citizen. I'm not a passive buyer of products. I'm an active agent of choice. What does it mean when we look at our elected representatives as the will of the people? They're not our leaders. They're elected They work for us. Like let's be mindful of this language. And again, to the people we're imagining are doing all these things, how true is that? Are they our elected leaders? Are they appointed officials? For just as a quick comparative place, Elon Musk, there's a lot of noise about him being an unelected official with all this power. And a few years back, we had Anthony Fauci as an unelected official with all this power. And so what's the principle here? Is the principle that there are unelected officials wielding a lot of power? Or is it a positional or party allegiant where this is good and this is bad? And we're going to make it about this principle, but not really, because we kind of looked the other way when this other principle was violated.
Right.
So what's the bigger picture?
Right. So that to me feels like a really good fourth order principle, which is that, am I bothered by an unelected official having a lot of power and making a lot of decisions that I may or may not agree with? Which would be, if the answer is yes, I don't like that, then I would be equally bothered by Fauci as I would by Musk. That's sort of your point. So the call then is like, the invitation is, can I go deeper in my principles so that I can transcend partisan politics and say like, I have a problem with this no matter who would be doing it, or no matter what they'd be, even if I agree 100% with what they're saying, I disagree with the way this is being done. That's the invitation that you're giving to people, to go to a deeper principle as they look at the political landscape.
That's the constant invitation, I think, that's facing all of us, and not necessarily to go forth and amplify the message. History's full of dead bodies from people who were questioning the tribe on principle. Jesus, MLK, Socrates put to death for challenging authority and corrupting the youth. It's like the same song, different verse, So, but for your own benefit and not being wrapped up in this sort of, this challenging either righteous rage. And another side of this coin, Keith, I think I want to really bring attention to here briefly, is the whole idea of what's called experiential bypassing. It's just rejecting joy, rejecting aliveness, rejecting pleasure. The world's burning and my suffering is noble or helpful or somehow required. It's like, no, joy is yours to be had, my friend. That's always a sign of the righteous indignation, is that they're just not funny. They can't think anything's funny, and they're always offended by everything. If that's you're probably not leading at your highest self. If you're always offended, you have low humor in your life, and if somebody says something that a lot of other people find funny, you're all upset about it, you're probably too far in that tribal identity, because it's challenging your sacred cows of what's funny or what's not funny. And I'm not willing to ruin my career by going on a comedic riff here, and I wouldn't encourage anybody else to.
Well, you want to be a professional comedian if you're going to do that.
Right. It's like taste and fashion have no accountability, and neither do senses of humor. But just understand that people have some.
Yeah.
And they're going to be different, and that's just the kind of the way things work.
Well, I love that Jeff Saltzman, who did the Daily Evolver, he said something along the lines of, and without getting political or taking a position, he just said, I'm so relieved that as a gay man, people can make fun of gay men again on X. And it was just such a beautiful statement of like, oh, thank God we've gotten to a point where we can be made fun of again. That's actually a sign that things are going well. Right? We don't have to tiptoe around, around these things. So to me, that's kind of what you're speaking to. So
it's like if you're anywhere close to like the stereotypical church marm and like propriety and dignity and harumphing around and just waiting to be offended by stuff, you're probably not at your highest edge. Yeah. And again, if that's comfortable for you, then I'm not going to say you're wrong, but like to your point, how is that working for you? Where's the joy in your life?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Where's the pleasure? Where's the warmth? Where's the humor? Where's the vitality?
Yeah.
Where is the appreciation of our shared human dignity? Are the rights that go with allowing somebody else to have their freedom of choice just like you want yours? And the idea to explore, what does it mean to make my own meaning in the world when I no longer believe the mass enculturation that we're all getting some version of? And like, wow, isn't this cool? We're in this sort of novel, high variability exploratory space of authoring ourselves, who we are, what our tastes are, whatever, and deciding what we want to keep from our cultural heritage, what's of value, and where we want to do, go beyond that. I think that's a space. Like, I want to hang out with those people.
Yeah.
I don't want to
Yeah,
hang
yeah,
out
yeah.
someplace where I'm always worried, did I say the wrong thing, or did I not wear the right shirt? Is my ties too skinny, like the Billy Joel song? What's going on here?
Right. Well, and I would, remind everyone, as I like to do, but it's, everything ultimately is a projection. Hard stop. Right. It's like, yeah, I think Kant figured that out pretty conclusively quite a long time ago, right? There
Mm-hmm.
is no, we don't have a reality outside of our human one. And I'm looking out at the window here and I'm seeing trees and bird feeders and all these constructs of language, right? But they're all relatively arbitrary constructs of language. And so we impose a human experience on this infinitely unfolding reality that is not really ours, right? That is a small part of what's really going on. And so for me, when I remember that everything is a construct, not in a nihilistic or deconstructed way, but in a beautiful emergent way, that this unfolding of reality is so further beyond this hyper object of reality and consciousness, right? It's like it allows me to relax and smile and not take myself too seriously and find the places where there's easy joy because it's so much bigger than me that it's actually quite funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What a relief
Right.
to rest in that space. Like on the one hand, we have the entire burden of coherent sense making thrust upon us here in the modern world of competing narratives, meta narratives. What's going on with UAPs and free energy and Ukraine, and like, wow, that's a lot to worry about, and much less make coherent sense of and have it all integrate. And it's like, you know what, I could do that, or I could kind of view it all with a degree of relaxation and what a relief it is just to bask in the present moment of our native human allowance of vivacity and joy and connection. I mean, you said all that way more beautifully than I ever could as your Zen master status. Thank you, Sensei.
No masters
Um,
here.
but that's the aspiration, and I believe, it might be too late in the show to pivot here, but there's a key point I think is worth making, and I'll try to be brief. In our developmental journey, we're constantly making the best decisions we can with the information we have as we're trying to climb up this ladder. There's an opportunity as we kind of phase shift out of that red imperial self into that blue socialized mind self. We make a lot of internal compromises to get to blue successfully, mostly repressing our selfish, self-centered nature in order to we need to go along to get along on some degree. As we emerge into the fourth order and that individuality, part of what is a key thing here is to go back on some level and revisit those earlier compromises we made. And how can we really parse out what does it mean to be self-authoring but not be selfish? There's a coffee mug. Self-care is not selfish. What does it mean to reject the dictates of the tribe in a post third order non-reactionary way that's different than just the rebel who just says no because you're not the boss of me? So you have to renegotiate these earlier developmental trade-offs and find those places where maybe there's been some trauma or there's been some repression or whatever. That energy is needed to continue the growth. And as you get into that fourth order and you stabilize and you start to move into that fifth order, self-transforming, more integral space, in a similar fashion, you're going to have to go back to that fourth order emergence that you largely did unconsciously to kind of fight your way out of the tribal grip and the gravity well that's always pulling you back. It's hard work to be an independent, semi-autonomous person, to be rooted in your tribal identity, but be free of it, you have to go back and renegotiate that boundary. Like, how did I reject the communism and how can I build communalism? How do I reject the tribalism and demand for conformity and build a new tribe of like-minded, pro-social, ecologically oriented, meta-aware fellow travelers in the university in the universe wearing a skin suit of a human right now? Like, it's a renegotiation, and that's I think the calling that I would ask of all of us here is to be more curious and be curious externally of like how are our fellow humans seeing things differently, our fellow citizens, but be internally curious and what are the sacrifices and compromises I've made on my own developmental journey. Where am I noticing them because they're pulling me back, or I have a hang up, or I'm triggered, or I'm shadow crashing, and using this as grist for my own mill of how can I be more integrated, more integral, more fully and freely operating in that realm of autonomous choice making, consequence owning, authentic dignity, having and enabling and allowing and relating to and from that dynamic. To me, that's where I think the real takeaway of the conversation here is that opportunity for an invitation for internal reflection, internal remetabolism, and internal holotropic continued aspiration.
Right. Great. Well, I think I want to give everyone listening a chance to gather questions if they would like. Feel free to chat them in, and feel free to call in too, though that can be a little buggy sometimes. So chat seems to work better. And in the meantime, you and I, David, as we were sort of working on this talk last week, we came up with 7 reflective questions, and I'm just going to read the questions to people, and we'll just let them sort of sit out there because I think they're good questions. I don't know if you came up with them or I came up with them, or I'm not sure where they came from, but I don't know. One of us has credit. But the questions are good questions when we think about the us versus them thing, when we feel ourselves othering someone, if we're really serious about wanting to get to the bottom of how do I know if I'm really taking a stand against someone in a way that's unsophisticated. It might be a shadow crash. So question 1 is, when's the last time I felt totally right about how wrong someone else was? 2 is, what part of me felt unsafe, unheard, or unseen in that moment, which is part of that triangle you're talking about. What language do I use that collapses someone into a label? Like they're just stupid, they're just ignorant. Who have I stopped being curious about? I think that's a very powerful question. What do I gain by othering, and what do I lose? Which is a big part of what we've talked about today. Can I imagine what it feels like to be inside the experience of the person I most oppose? Well, that's a very devilish question, because that's going to force empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And empathy is anathema to self-righteousness. And then the final one, what if I said, this too is me if I had lived their life? And that's also an empathetic question. And to me, this gets back to the circles of care. If we want to change people, and we really believe that we are on the right side of history, and maybe you are, you're going to be a lot more effective if you connect with people from the heart, from compassion, and from understanding their position, even if you completely disagree with it, right? But to your point, seeing their basic human dignity will allow them to see your basic human dignity, and you can actually have a real conversation if that's happening, but you may have to do the work.
I'm going to put an asterisk by may. Will.
You likely will have to do the work. And to your point, I've driven across this country many times in many different ways, and I've sat to many a MAGA person, and when I've been curious and open and genuinely receptive to what they're saying, you learn a lot. You get very humbled about what you think people are like when you're confronted with their humanness and their care and their own concern. So that, to me, that's always an invitation. The so-called worst among us are almost always coming from care, right? barring the 5% of the cluster B personality types, right, which are the sort of malignant people, but that's a small percentage of people. Most of us are coming from our care.
Yeah, and there's, I think when RFK Jr. was still exploring getting a candidacy, a lifelong Democrat, as a reminder, trying to get an opportunity to be considered on the Democratic ticket, he put out some polls that he had been running that showed all the places that Americans were 60% or higher agreed upon. And it was like, this is the platform I'm trying to run on. This look at all the stuff we agree upon on where changes need to be made or where there's opportunities to improve stuff. This is the America I want to represent running into, trying to get into the main office. And as all politicians know, that's not how it works. You have to pick a side and raise your money and serve the interest. And as a consequence, his candidacy was derailed from the inside, much like Bernie Sanders was back in 2016. And like there was no candidacy ultimately on the Democratic side. And same with the Trump side. There was no willing opponent to actually make it a true primary. And it's the same challenge that we all face. Like, what do real Americans agree upon? It's a lot more than what we're being shown through our social media windows that are trying to do, or all the media windows that are trying to get money, is that you need eyeballs, and you need eyeballs. You got to get people upset. So you're looking for virality and intensity, and anger and division is what sells. Like, it used to be what sex sells, but now it's anger and division and a little bit of booty shaking in the background. And that's where the algorithms are making their money. And so it's partly on us to like stop. When you sign, go cleanse your social media feed. Go see all the things that you follow. And like, is this really going to give me the best chance to see this common dignity, to be in a place where I'm not just algorithmically activated, I am choosing to follow ideas. Like, it's an Eleanor Roosevelt quote all over again. Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. How much of your thinking is around people? How much is it around events? And how much is it around ideas and principles? Like, these are some easy ways to like self-elevate your attention, your awareness, what you're spending your bandwidth on, to help yourself be a better version of yourself, and then lead by example with those around you.
Well said. Well said. Well, I think we've covered enough territory. Do you feel complete on your end?
Well, I never feel complete on these topics, but I feel good enough for now. I feel like we got through some stuff. Maybe it's not as much of a straight, coherent line as that part of my logical brain would have liked, but it was a fun, engaging conversation. We touched on a lot of topics, and again, it's part of the ongoing conversation. Great. And we're trying to add our bit to it. So I feel awesome. Thank you again for the opportunity to come and connect with you here on your platform. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. And, it's an important topic, the idea of how do we come together again? It's something I'm very passionate about. If people want to know more about you, David, or work with you, where would they go?
You can find me over at catalystforchange.xyz, www.catalystforchange.xyz. You can email me simply to david@catalystforchange.xyz. Again, I'm happy to engage in these conversations. Some of our previous ones have generated some interesting email dialogues, which I always find fascinating. So feel free to shoot me an email, and we can continue the conversation offline.
And I imagine if your inbox is like my inbox, you might get a few people that are certainly doing a little us versus theming. I can't believe that you didn't talk about it. It's like, did you listen to the talk? The one on Shadow and Trump was really funny. A bunch of people wrote these really angry emails, and it was like, okay, thank you for writing.
Well, yeah, and you addressed their dignity, their safety, and their belonging needs, and they felt good about it. They got the chance to say their piece. Which again, speech is always a better alternative to them coming to your house and kicking your door down. So
that is true. That is why speech is not violence.
Right.
All right, brother. Well, it was great talking to you, and thank you everybody for joining us. We'll see you in 2 weeks.